The copa room of the Grand Gala at the Hotel de Paris was not supposed to be a battlefield. It was supposed to be an evening of crystal chandeliers and vintage Bordeaux, of tuxedos pressed sharp enough to cut glass, of perfume that cost more than a working man's monthly salary. The terrace overlooked the shimmering lights of Monaco, and the Mediterranean stretched out beyond it like a dark promise. Everything was exactly as beautiful as it was supposed to be, which made what happened at 9:47 in the evening all the more ugly. Senator Clifford Hargrove III was a man who had never once in his 61 years been told that he couldn't have something he wanted. He was from old Virginia money, the kind that predates the Civil War and doesn't apologize for it. He had 2 Senate terms under his belt, a wife he ignored in Washington, and a smile that had convinced 3 generations of constituents that he was the voice of the common man. He was not the voice of the common man. He was a common man's nightmare wearing a tailored suit. He'd arrived in Monaco with a delegation that existed mostly on paper. The real reason he was there was the same reason men like Hargrove always invented reasons to be places. Because he could. Because somewhere along the line, someone had told him the world was his dining room, and he believed them completely. Grace Kelly was holding court near the stone balustrade when Hargrove found her. She had become Princess Grace of Monaco the previous year. But even before the title, she carried herself with a quality that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. She wasn't performing elegance. She simply wasn't. She was laughing at something the Belgian ambassador had said, her hand resting lightly on the marble railing, the lights of the harbor catching the diamonds at her throat. Hargrove excused himself from his own conversation mid-sentence. He crossed the terrace without invitation. He positioned himself between Grace and the ambassador with the practiced ease of a man who has been inserting himself between other people his entire life. Grace, he said, not your highness, not princess. Grace, as if they had a history that existed only in his head. She turned. The smile she gave him was a precise, cool smile of a woman who has been dealing with Clifford Hargrove her whole life without ever having met him specifically. She recognized the type immediately. She'd grown up surrounded by them in Philadelphia. Senator Hargrove, she said, welcome to Monaco. What happened next depended on who you asked. The Belgian ambassador would later say the senator placed his hand on Her Highness's waist. A French countess standing 12 feet away said it was her arm, pulled with unmistakable force. A junior American diplomat who witnessed everything said the senator leaned into Grace's ear and said something that made her stiffen like a woman who has just been reminded that the world is not as civilized as it pretends to be. All 3 accounts agreed on one thing. Grace Kelly's expression changed, and Dean Martin saw it happen from across the terrace. Dean Martin was not supposed to be paying attention to anything political that evening. He was there because Frank had called and said Monaco in September, and Dean had said yes before Frank finished the sentence. He'd spent the early part of the evening doing what he did best, making everything look effortless. A drink in hand that he may or may not have actually been drinking. A laugh that filled whatever room he was in without trying. A presence that somehow managed to be both the life of the party and completely at ease. He'd known Grace for years. Not the princess version, the Grace Kelly version. The girl from Philadelphia who walked onto a film set and made every other actress in Hollywood reconsider their career choices. They had a friendship built on mutual respect, on shared laughter, on the particular understanding that exists between 2 people who are very good at performing and very aware that they're performing. When he saw her expression change, he went very still. That stillness was something people who knew Dean Martin well recognized as dangerous. He was a man who operated in a permanent state of relaxed warmth, and when that warmth disappeared, when the easy smile flattened and the eyes went quiet, it meant something had shifted underneath, something tectonic. He watched Hargrove lean in again, watched Grace take a small, precise step backward, watched the senator close, that step like a man who has never been told what a boundary is. Dean set his glass down on the nearest surface. He didn't rush. He didn't storm across the terrace. He walked the way he always walked, measured, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and had simply decided to use some of it here, now, in this direction. He arrived at Grace's side and stood there for exactly 3 seconds before saying anything. Those 3 seconds were an education in themselves. They communicated. I see what's happening. I am deciding what to do about it. You should take that time to decide too. Grace, he said warmly and kissed her cheek. Then he turned to Hargrove as if noticing him for the first time, which both men understood was a performance. Senator, Hargrove smiled the smile of a man who is not accustomed to being interrupted. Dean Martin, didn't know you were in Monaco. Monaco knew I was coming. Dean said pleasantly, most places do. Hargrove laughed. Men like Hargrove always laugh at things like that because they weren't listening closely enough to hear the steel underneath the velvet. Grace and I were just getting reacquainted. Hargrove said, and there was something in the way he said it. Something possessive and proprietary, something that reduced a princess and an Oscar-winning actress to a thing that could be gotten reacquainted with. Were you? Dean said. Not a question. A statement delivered in the register of a fact being examined. Grace touched Dean's arm. Perhaps we should find Frank, she said. Frank's inside, Dean said. He didn't move. He was still looking at Hargrove with that calm, unhurried attention. Senator, I wonder if you might do me a favor. Hargrove blinked. The shift in subject threw him. What kind of favor? I'm looking for a word, Dean said. The word for when a man is somewhere he hasn't been invited, doing something he hasn't been asked to do, to someone who clearly doesn't want him doing it. He paused. You strike me as a man with a large vocabulary. What's that word? The temperature on the terrace dropped approximately 4 degrees. Hargrove's smile didn't disappear. Men like him don't let their smiles disappear in public, because public smiles are armor, but something behind it recalibrated. I don't think I appreciate your tone, Martin. I don't think I need you to appreciate it, Dean said. What happened next happened very quickly. Hargrove, who had apparently decided that the solution to being challenged was to perform dominance even more aggressively, reached out and gripped Dean's lapel. It was a gesture of a man who has grabbed other men's lapels before and found that it worked. It was a mistake. Dean looked down at the hand on his lapel. Then he looked up at Hargrove's face. You're going to want to think very carefully about the next 5 seconds, Dean said quietly. Hargrove tightened his grip. The next 5 seconds went in a direction that Senator Clifford Hargrove III had not anticipated. He moved with a speed and precision that nobody standing on that terrace expected from a man who spent his public life looking half asleep. He broke the senator's grip on his lapel with a twist of his forearm that was economical and complete. He took hold of Hargrove by the collar with one hand and by the belt with the other. And before the senator could process what was happening, before his body had caught up with the sudden rearrangement of his dignity, Dean Martin walked him to the balustrade. The balustrade of the Hotel de Paris terrace is approximately waist height on a standing man. Below it is a 15-foot drop to a lower terrace, and below that, the lights of Monaco going all the way down to the harbor. Dean Martin tipped Senator Clifford Hargrove III over that balustrade by his ankles. He held him there. The senator dangled. His arms windmilled. His jacket fell over his face. His pocket square drifted down into the Mediterranean night. Hargrove's colleagues, who had been watching the confrontation from across the terrace with the particular paralysis of men who cannot decide which outcome serves them better, stared in collective, absolute silence. The Belgian ambassador stared. The French countess stared. The junior American diplomat, who had been frantically calculating whether to intervene, stared. Grace Kelly looked at Dean Martin hanging Senator Hargrove from the balcony of one of Europe's most prestigious hotels, and she did not look away. I want you to listen to me very carefully, Dean said to the upside-down man below him. His voice was calm, conversational, even like he was explaining something simple to someone who needed simple explanations. Because I'm going to say this once, and the next time I have to say anything to you at all, I'm going to be much less polite about it. Hargrove's response was not dignified. The lady you were touching, Dean continued, is a princess. She is also a person, which means she was a person before she was a princess, and she's going to continue to be a person long after men like you have been forgotten. You don't touch her. You don't speak to her with that particular tone you were using, which I've heard before from men of your type, and which I find deeply irritating. You don't stand in her space when she has clearly communicated without words, because women like Grace don't need words to communicate this. that she wants you elsewhere. He paused. Below him, Hargrove made a sound. I'm not done, Dean said pleasantly. You came here tonight wearing the flag of the United States on your reputation, which means whatever you do here, whatever impression you leave it on behalf of every American in this building and a good number who aren't. I take that seriously, Senator. I wonder if you do. The silk of Hargrove's trousers had bunched around his ankles where Dean's hands held him. His face, which had been pink with importance 40 seconds ago, was now red with blood rushing to it. His cufflinks, monogrammed, naturally, caught the light of the terrace lanterns. Here's what's going to happen, Dean said. I'm going to pull you back up. You're going to straighten your jacket and your tie, and you're going to walk across this terrace, and you are going to find Princess Grace, and you are going to apologize to her. Not because it benefits you diplomatically, not because there are witnesses, because she is owed an apology by you, and a man pays his debts. Dean looked out at the terrace. Every person present was watching. Every person present would remember this for the rest of their lives. Then Dean said, you are going to spend the rest of this evening on the other side of whatever room you're in from wherever she is. And tomorrow morning, you and your delegation are going to take your plane and your flag and your pocket squares and your particular brand of conversation, and you are going to go home. And you are never, ever going to come within the same zip code as this woman again. Are we absolutely clear? Senator Clifford Hargrove III, hanging by his ankles from a Monte Carlo balcony with the Mediterranean spread out beneath him and his dignity irretrievably scattered somewhere in the distance, said, yes. Louder, Dean said. Yes. Hargrove said louder. Dean pulled him up, efficiently, without drama, as if returning a senator from the edge of a balcony was something he did on a regular Tuesday and found only moderately interesting. Hargrove landed back on the terrace on unsteady legs. His jacket had twisted. His hair, previously arranged with the architectural certainty of a man who has a staff member whose entire job is his hair, had come apart completely. He looked, for the first time in his adult life, like what he actually was, a frightened man who had badly misjudged the situation. He looked at the 30-odd people watching him. He looked at Dean Martin, who was straightening his own lapels with the calm efficiency of a man who has simply concluded one small errand and is preparing for the evening to resume. He looked at Grace Kelly, who was watching him with an expression that could not have been described as warm. He crossed the terrace. The crowd parted for him not with deference, but with a particular silence of witnesses who were collectively deciding how they will describe this later. He stopped in front of Grace. Your Highness, he said, and the title came out of him like something being extracted by force. I owe you an apology. My behavior this evening was inexcusable. I am sorry. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, Senator, she said. Her voice was cool and precise and gave him nothing extra. He nodded once. He walked to the far end of the terrace. His colleagues followed him with the subdued energy of men who have witnessed something they are not sure how to file. Dean resumed his position beside Grace. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know, he said. You could have gotten into serious trouble. He's on the Foreign Relations Committee. And he's now on the list of people who know what it looks like from 15 feet up. Dean said, I think that was worth the trade. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then, you terrified him. I know, Dean said again. Good, said Grace Kelly. The story was out before sunrise. Not in the newspapers, not yet, not officially, but in a particular telegraph network of high society, which moves faster than any newsroom and with considerably more editorial freedom. By the time the Monte Carlo morning light was coming through the shuttered windows of the Hotel de Paris, every significant person in Monaco had heard 3 different versions of what had happened on the terrace the previous night. By noon, the story had reached Paris. By evening, it was in London. By the following morning, it had crossed the Atlantic. Senator Hargrove had taken his delegation and his plane home at 7 in the morning, before the hotel dining room opened for breakfast, before any of the people who had witnessed last night's events were awake to watch him go. He was not fast enough. The story was waiting for him at Dulles. Back in Monaco, Dean Martin slept until noon. What most people watching the terrace incident didn't understand was that the balcony moment was the opening move, not the end game. Dean didn't operate on impulse. What looked like impulse was actually the visible surface of a calculation that had happened in the 3 seconds he'd spent standing still after Grace's expression changed. He'd identified the situation, assessed the variables, and chosen the response that would accomplish the most things simultaneously. The morning after the incident, before he'd had his first coffee, he made 3 phone calls. The first was to a journalist he trusted, not to give him the story outright, but to confirm certain facts about the senator's committee positions, his upcoming re-election campaign, and the nature of his financial relationships with several defense contractors who did business with Western European governments. Information that was technically public. Information that, assembled together, told a story of its own. The second call was to a man in Washington whose entire professional existence consisted of knowing things and knowing who to tell them to and when. Dean didn't ask him to do anything specific. He simply described what happened on the terrace and expressed his concern that a man of the senator's character was sitting on committees that involved, among other things, foreign dignitary relations. The third call was to Frank Sinatra, who listened in silence and then said, "I'll make some calls." Frank's calls went to different places than Dean's. Frank's calls went to people who had photographs. Senator Hargrove's office issued a statement that Monday describing his trip to Monaco as productive. It did not mention the gala. It did not mention Princess Grace. The statement was, in the parlance of Washington communication professionals, a clean surface placed over a problem. The problem did not stay covered. The junior diplomat's account had already been shared with 2 senior State Department officials by Wednesday. By Thursday, a political columnist had published an item describing a Monaco incident involving an unnamed senator and an unnamed entertainer who had reportedly taken a dramatic stand. Anyone who had heard any version of the story knew exactly who the unnamed parties were. By Friday, photographs arrived. They were not photographs of the balcony incident. They were photographs from 2 years earlier at a different event, in a different country, documenting a pattern of behavior so consistent that the Monaco incident ceased to look like an isolated lapse in judgment and started to look like Tuesday. 2 senior senators called for Hargrove to step down from the Foreign Relations Committee. He stepped down that Friday, citing a desire to focus on constituency work. Washington watched. Dean Martin was in Los Angeles recording an album, looking relaxed, making no public statements about any of it. Senator Clifford Hargrove III did not run for a 3rd term. He retired from the Senate in 1962, citing his health, and returned to Virginia, where he spent the remainder of his years in a quiet that was neither peaceful nor comfortable, the kind of quiet that settles over a man when the world has made a decision about him and stopped calling. There was a code that Dean Martin operated by that was never written down and never stated explicitly, but that people who spent time around him eventually understood through observation. It was not a complicated code. It had very few articles. The first article was that people who couldn't protect themselves deserved to be protected. And if you were capable of providing that protection, and you didn't, you had made a choice, and that choice said something about you. The second article was that power was not the same as right. A man could be powerful and completely wrong, and the power didn't make him less wrong. It just made people more reluctant to say so. The third article, which was perhaps the most important, that dignity was not a luxury, not a bonus distributed based on status or wealth or who your father was. It was a baseline. It was the floor. Every human being stood on it. And when someone tried to take it from another person, that was a specific act that required a specific response. Many years later, a journalist researching a biography of Grace, Kelly tracked down the junior American diplomat who had been present at the gala. He was older now, a senior man, in a life full of rooms and significant moments. He described the evening in careful, measured terms. The dinner, the chandeliers, the Mediterranean spread out below the terrace, like a promise the world was making to itself. He described the moment Grace Kelly's expression changed. He described Dean Martin crossing the terrace, the stillness, the words, and then he described what it looked like. A man in a tuxedo holding another man upside down from a Monaco balcony at 9:47 in the evening. The city lights glittering below, the night air warm, the crowd on the terrace absolutely silent. I've been in a lot of rooms over 60 years of diplomatic service, the former diplomat said. I've seen a lot of moments. Moments that seem significant and turn out not to be. Moments that seem small and turn out to change everything. He paused. It meant that on one night in Monte Carlo in 1958, a man looked around a terrace and saw something happening that wasn't right, and he decided it was his problem to fix. Not because he had to, not because it was safe, but because he was there, and he was capable, and she was his friend, and that was enough. He looked out the window. That's a rarer thing than people think, he said. A much rarer thing. Monte Carlo, 1958. The night Senator Clifford Hargrove III learned that power has a ceiling, and below it, Dean Martin was always holding your ankles. That's not a threat. That's a legacy. And legacies last longer than senators.